Okay, so this is a primer. You guys know that, right? This is 101 appraising. So, and a lot of you look like, I think you probably have had some experience with appraising, and probably I'm worried, a little worried that this is going to be redundant for you, but let me know. Let's see, in terms of questions as we go, if you could mute yourself, and then if you want to say something, go ahead and jump in. How about that? Let's try doing that. And if it gets too chaotic, we'll have to change it. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go to my little notes. And also I have to say I am not a PowerPoint queen. So these notes are very basic. All right, so share, here we go. So that's our intro thing. How do I go to the next one? There we go. So there's a lot of different kinds of appraisals. Wait, is that my right? Yeah, so there's a lot of different kinds of appraisals. But the three big ones are that we want to know about for our purposes are the IRS and the 3Ds, death, which is an estate appraisal, divorce, donations, right? And those have their own requirements. Then there's insurance. If you have art you want to insure, and or if you need to know how to insure it for a loss. And also I should say with insurance that you should always find out from your insurer what they need, and be very, very careful about reading the policy, because many agents will say, oh yeah, we insure art, but when the pedal hits the road, they don't. If there's a loss, it won't be covered. And a lot of insurance companies have different requirements. Like one client I had, they required anything over $5,000 to have a formal appraisal. Another client, their insurance company didn't require anything under $100,000 to have a formal appraisal. So you really need to dig in on that one before if you want to insure your art. And then there's the, I just want to know in case I want to sell. And that is, everyone wants to know what they have. Short of going to Antique Roadshow, you turn to an appraiser. And that's a very hard kind of assignment for an appraiser, because in some ways, but the thing you really want to know about that is that appraisals are only good for 3 years. So I had a photographer who wanted to find out, and this is hard for you if you have an archive, because it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. You want to know what this thing you're working like a slave to organize is worth, but at the same time, you don't want to shell out $15,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 for something that you're not going to move on for 3, 5, or 10 years. So you have to kind of time it, and maybe what you need is not a full-on appraisal, but maybe just consulting with someone, right? And you could just pay by the hour to find out certain things that you'd want to know to kind of create your strategy. That makes sense? Okay. So yeah, so here's more. Like there's retail, these are the different kinds. So retail replacement, which is for insurance, retail value, which is for if I want to sell it for sure. There's market value also, if I want to sell it in an open market, but it's a secondary image. There's fair market value, which is used for a lot of the IRS purposes. There's marketable cash value, which is for a divorce. There's orderly liquidation and forced liquidation, which is, pennies on the dollar, right? So here's how they differ. Retail replacement value for insurance is the highest value. So you use the full retail value, less like whatever discount. Most dealers will give you a 10% discount, but then you add on tax, and if it has a frame, you calculate the frame. If for example, you had to replace your piece of art and the only place you could buy it is in New York, you would add on shipping and commission, et cetera. So it's really the highest value. Fair market, on the other hand, is what's used for donations, sometimes for divorce and death also. And they use secondary market values, which are most often auction values. So those are typically less than retail, not so much anymore because of the online market, and platforms have brought the differential between auction and retail closer together in many, many cases, but that's where an appraiser would turn for valuations for donations and estates. And so with those values, you know how an auction price, there's a hammer price, and then there's the premium, right? The hammer is what the seller gets, and the premium is the commission that goes to the auction house. But so the value that you would quote it would be the auction value with the premium, but it doesn't include any other fees. Any questions about that? Nope. Okay. So this is really a primer, guys. I'm just saying, it's not, you know, new stuff. So for appraisals that involve the IRS, you need to have a qualified appraiser. And there's not really a distinct, specific definition, except that, you know, they know what they're doing basically. But the one thing that the IRS says is that they have to have a current certificate for the USPAP, which is the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. And so you should ask your appraiser if they have that. And even if you're not getting something done for the IRS, it's good if your appraiser has that knowledge and that capacity, because it's just a higher level of appraisal, and it's more uniform and professional. And also insurance companies are requiring this more often. It's becoming the norm. So the other thing, when they say qualified, they don't specifically, the IRS in their publications, you know, talks about a qualified appraiser, but one way to find a qualified appraiser is to look at the organizations that the trade organizations, either the AAA, the American Association of Appraisers, the ASA, the American Society of Appraisers, or the ISA, the International Society of Appraisers, because they require continuing education. They require their members to have the USPAP. And there's actually a very strange and convoluted supervisory umbrella through the federal government. It's not a direct line, but it's an oddball thing. But it ensures that you're getting a higher quality appraiser, which is important, obviously. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I have a question here about my work, which is broken into two different things. One is my negatives, which are original negatives. They may be, you know, celluloid negatives. And the prints that I make from those sell for anywhere between $5,000 and $30,000. But if I want to insure the original negatives themselves, they obviously won't be insured for the kind of level that a print would be. So how do you develop a measure of the value of original negatives?
Well, okay, negatives are, okay, I'm just kind of getting to that in a little bit, but it's a very weird area, because traditionally the photography market has been the print market, and negatives were always valued very, very low, which doesn't make any sense, because they're sort of like, you know, it's like the Rosetta Stone, right? Why would you, anyway. So, but lately that has been changing. So what you would do, what you do is you would insure your top rated, big money making negatives. There's a business formula that you can get off the net for present value, and you would mark it to future earnings and tag it with the 30-year T-bond, right? So there's a whole formula for doing that. That's how an appraiser would do it.
Right.
Okay. So
very good.
yeah. So I'm coming to that. So donation value requirements. So anything you donate that's under $5,000 does not require an appraisal. And you can basically name your price on that. And then if any art valued between $5,001 and $20,000 requires an appraiser, but it doesn't, but you don't have to submit a formal report with your documentation to the IRS. So like sometimes you can get, if you have a dealer who's a friend, or if you have someone, you know, who's not necessarily an appraiser who could do it for you, that's adequate and that's fine. And they would sign, what you have to do is at the bottom, it says you have to submit this IRS from the 8283, and they can sign that form. But if it's over $20,000, then it does require a qualified appraiser who has the USPAP certification, and you have to submit a formal appraisal to the IRS. And then any appraisal submitted to the IRS for over $50,000 will be reviewed by the IRS art panel. So, and that's where all the like crazy legal wrangling happens about these crazy cases there. So does that
Melanie, that's one thing I could never quite understand about this amounts. So let's say you're making like a donation, right, from your collection.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to take a tax deduction, and so say you're like donating 5 things, 5 items, and each one is under $5,000.
It's the aggregate.
So it's the aggregate of.
And furthermore, if you're doing 2,000 to this institution and 3,000 to that institution, and 2,000 to that institution, it's an aggregate. Like I have a client who does a lot of donations of a lot of different kinds of things, but like last year, his wife donated a $1,200 print to her alma mater. And I had to write a formal appraisal for that because in aggregate, his donations were over $5,000.
I'm a little confused.
I mean, $20,000.
Melanie, on this charity donation, I've donated to various institutions, but I did not take any deduction for that because I've been under the impression that the artist could not deduct more than the value of the work. Now here we're estimating we have art that can be valued because it sells for a certain amount, but the artists themselves, how do they take advantage of that?
You can't. You cannot. The only thing you can get is the cost of materials. So like the cost of a black and white 8x10 is like $5 or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's been a problem forever. But if you gift that work to somebody else, that other person can take, you know, the owner can take a donation.
Well, that's the big holy grail with this whole thing with archives, is that you want to find, you know, a wealthy person who will buy your archive from you, and then they need to hold it for a year and a day, and then they can donate it and get a write-off there. So yeah, that's the only way you can really do it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So
yeah,
we haven't figured that one out yet.
Yeah.
So that's going to take some legal wrangling, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, did you have another question?
No, please go on.
Okay, so this is a quick slide. This is just how one piece of art can have 3 different values depending on the purpose of the appraisal. So for example, if you're insuring it, the retail replacement would be $22,000. If you wanted to, if this is for an estate, it would be anywhere between $6,000 and $10,000. And I have here in parentheses a discount for quantity, because let's say you have, like I have a client who had like 700 photographs when he died. And so what happens is you get you have to calculate in what's called a blockage discount. And that is a phrase that comes from the stock market when people would sell in huge quantities, huge shares of stock, and they would sink the market. So they're calculating in a theoretical deluge on the market of this material, which is, again, maybe not exactly always the case, but that's how these appraisals are supposed to be done. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So if there's only one piece that when you die and you have this in your estate, let's say you have really you collect oil paintings, but you have one photograph and it's worth $10,000. Well, you would keep that $10,000 value because that one print is not going to
flood the market.
Flood the market. That's the word. I kept thinking submerge. It's not going to flood the market.
Drown.
But your paintings, if you have 50 paintings, they're going to get discounted for quantity. They're going to get the blockage discount because theoretically, if they could flood the market.
Well, I guess it depends though, Melanie, if you have paintings by different periods, different artists, right, it's not going to matter. But if you have like 25 Picassos and they all come on the market theoretically at the same time, then they'll depress the values. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Or it could be a period. Let's say it's all impressionists or it's all abstract expressionists. It has to be something in it that could really change the market if it hit the market. And then of course at the bottom you have just a donation. It's straight up for the $10,000. So okay, all right. So when you appraise an archive, here's some of the considerations. Every archive is unique and it's complicated and there's a lot of things to consider. These are just some of the broad swaths. Okay. So you first, and what you guys have all done is organize the work by quality. So your A prints will be the top 100 or 200 images which made that photographer's reputation. They're the big sellers and they have the most licensing potential. The B prints are what they say, B prints. They're not iconic, but they're good prints. They could possibly down the road have value as people look back on them and rediscover the work. And then you have the rest. So then negatives, to get to your thing, Steve, a little bit. It's very complicated because the photo market, as I said, has always been in prints, but that is sort of changing. And like, for example, there was a wax paper negative that was sold because it was seen as an art object in and of itself. So it sold for $80,000. At ICP, a few years ago, I was talking to the archivist there, and he told me that they insured all their negatives, regardless of how magnificent or iconic the image was, at $15 each. But I think even when I was talking to him, he was like, well, maybe I should reconsider that. It's like, yeah, you should reconsider that. And recently a photojournalist got $1,500 for a damaged negative. And then, but what happens like in an archive, so it's all over the place with the negatives. And there's no, it's just, you have to make a case for that negative and the valuation that you put to it. So Milton Green, when his unpublished transparencies were sold, most of them sold for $14 per negative. But there was one specific shot of Marilyn Monroe, which was unpublished, but fantastic. And that went for $30,000. So you can see it's kind of a crazy thing, right? Kind of squirrely. Okay, so on those A prints, how you evaluate the potential income. Like if you're gonna donate or sell your archive, that's what you want. This is part of how you evaluate it. So first you have to determine if the work is editorial or commercial and what the markets are. Do these A prints sell as prints? Can they be used for advertising? Would they be better? Is there a market for them in books? Is there commercial licensing, like, like umbrellas, or is there, editorial licensing, like historical images to come? And then you have to calculate the cost of bringing this to market, the cost of making the prints or printing the books, any commissions, digitization, all the costs. You have to think of how long will this be making money? 5 years, 20 years? It's hard. These are not easy questions, but this is something when and partly what you do is you would look at past revenue, find comparables, like who is a comparable artist, what have they done, which is also very hard, because if you have an archive, if you're looking at the archive of a comparable artist, but that archive has been poorly managed, that's not necessarily an accurate prediction of what your archive could do. So it's a complicated thing, and you have to be careful choosing your comparables when you try to calculate this. And then there's all the issues involving copyright. If you donate your archive, are you including the rights? Are there restrictions on this? And so on and so forth. And if it's editorial, of course, you actually have to make sure that there's model releases, because they're not going to be usable if they don't have the documentation with it about the model releases. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So out of an archive with 10,000 prints, maybe 200 are A quality, but probably really more like 100 or 80. And of those, only the top 1% will generate, or maybe 100 at the very most, will generate any revenue. So that's when you have to go back and use all those criteria to figure out the revenue. So you would use the current value, which you would get from auction. If it's prints, you would get them from auction sales. And then you would calculate the potential income over whatever you decide that is, 5 years, 10 years. And then you use this business formula tied to the 30-year note, which is what I was telling you before, Steve. And it's just a mathematical thing.
Right. I was very interested in your negative versus the licensing. I have certain images that I license out through Getty, and it brings in quite a bit of income. And that is separate from the negative itself. The physical embodiment of the negative,
right?
Maybe, it may be worth something, but it's the licensing that really has the value.
Right. And the other thing I didn't write on here is that the things that Getty is selling are scans, right? So in that way, that's a whole different medium. So mm-hmm. and the scans in some ways make the negative not important.
That's right. It's the scan that really is everything.
That would be your A list of items.
Right.
Yeah.
In the digital world, right, when we don't have negatives, but we have, what do we have as the equivalent of a negative? That's called a scan. But if you have
actually the scan and a digital file are the same.
The digital file, right?
Right. Okay.
Well, a scan could be a scan from a print, and it could have a different quality than the original digital file, right?
Right.
So we're talking about valuing original digital files. Have you come across that?
Yeah, those are evaluated as their own medium, and you would definitely look at the quality of the digital file, how it compares to how the artist originally wanted it to be, or how many pixels, if it's good scan or not. Yeah. So that's how you would evaluate the condition portion of it. Does that make sense? Or
yeah, well, I mean, another question is, okay, you have the original digital file, right? Like the way whatever the scene was shot, right? Like the raw file. And then there will be several versions of it, let's say edited in Lightroom,
Right.
from which potentially either, you know, digital file, other digital files or prints are generated.
The
Well,
quality, let me just say, I sell a fair amount of these, and the quality, like from Getty has a standard resolution that they ask their photographers to send them in, 3,600 pixels, which for them means that it works great for books and publications. Now, you're dealing with something at a higher level if you're talking about making large prints. But most of my licensing is really done for publication purposes. And I don't have to send them a very high resolution scan for that. And it works perfectly. So in your case, you know, you've got to decide where the licensing is going to be used. But most of the time, it's not super high resolution.
But I wasn't necessarily talking about the resolution. I'm trying to understand what's considered in that digital universe, what's considered to be like the original, right? Because in film photography, you would have the negative, right? And then you'll work in a dark room and produce several versions of prints from that negative.
Yeah.
Now here you have like the original sort of digital file, right, from your camera.
Right.
And then there will be a number of edited versions, which are also digital files and could be high resolution or low resolution. But like what's, you know,
well, it depends on where
to
you're
be the original, and
it really depends on where you're taking your
actually,
scan from.
wait, actually the answer is the original file would be the first image that was taken.
Right.
That's like the negative, right?
Yes.
The digital version.
The
And
raw
the other
file is the
version,
original scan. Yes.
pardon, yeah. And then the versions, let's say, you know, this version with this Photoshop, whatever, has made $1 million. This version just never sold. And this version over here is okay. I mean, so then what you would do, you would take the Photoshop one, and that's how you would calculate the licensing. You would use that one, because that's the one that makes the money.
Exactly.
Right?
Okay, got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Devik, did you have something to add?
No, you've explained it quite well, because I take my highly saleable negatives are the ones that I have photoshopped afterwards, because I could improve them far beyond what I could have done on paper through the original, you know, silver gelatin. And it's that one, that modified one, that I've improved to the point where that becomes the really highly saleable item. And that's the one you want to talk about.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
That's it. Ta-da!